A Shot in the Dark by Silverpup. Chapter 11. Oin had always considered himself a rather simple dwarf. He liked to fight, to eat, to read, and to sing. He didn't care for elves, olives, or liars. He was loyal to his king first, his family second, and his friends and allies third. He believed that everything happened for a reason, and letting go of things you could not control. All in all, he was not very complicated. This way of thinking, simple and practical, was why he liked their hobbit burglar. Bilbo Baggins had made it very clear that his one desire was to see them all safely to Erebor. He had proved his intentions time and time again, from little things like allowing the younger ones to eat first during supper, to bigger things like protecting Kili from the orcs and trolls. Oin appreciated this blunt and honest wish. The only thing about Bilbo that didn't make him wary was his lack of self-preservation. He was deaf in one ear, yes, but he sure wasn't blind. He had seen how reckless the hobbit was with his own life. He threw himself into battle without hesitation, didn't flinch to protect others with his own life, and even asked the others to put themselves before him. He seemed not to care whether he lived or died at all. The dwarf was sure he wasn't the only one who noticed. The wizard noticed and was concerned, and Dory definitely noticed because he was such a mother hen. He had a feeling even Thorin had recognized it but hadn't said anything because he didn't know how to deal with it. None of them had acted on their concerns though, which meant it was up to him to take care of their burglar. Oin was a healer. It was in his nature to try and help others, even when they didn't want it. Bilbo Baggins did not seem to care if he lived or died, but Oin did, and he was going to keep him alive no matter what they faced. Even if Bilbo didn't want to be. After all the hugging and weeping and laughing came the task of recuperating. The orc corpses made the area highly undesirable to stay in, so they bundled everything that was still salvageable and headed out to find a safer place to rest and heal. Gandalf led them to the dark forest while the others helped the wounded as they began the task of walking down the mountain. Eventually, they found a clearing that seemed relatively safe and made camp for the second time that night. Bilbo found himself a cozy corner where he had the perfect view of everyone and was still close enough to jump to their aid. There he made his bed and began to look over his own wounds and bruises. There weren't very many since he had been invisible and unnoticed for most of the battle, but he couldn't dodge everything in the fight. Thankfully, most of them were minor and unimportant injuries, so he was able to tend to them without going to Oin. Once he was done, he sat back and watched his companions. Oin was looking over Fili, Nori, and Bolver, as they had the most wounds. It actually looked rather difficult since none of them were interested in healing, but in recounting their tale of capture to the others. The Nori stood up, looked it straight in the eye, and said, "You call that a kick? Who trained you? Here, let me show you how it's done." Then he knocked it off its feet with one leg sweep, all while still being tied up. Fili boasted between Kili and Ori. The dwarves laughed and hooted while Nori shrugged and scratched at his swollen nose. "Well, it was a bad kick. Didn't even leave a bruise. Pathetic." "They left enough marks," Dory pointed out from his side. He was attempting to get his brother to eat, but was obviously failing as Nori kept pushing his hand away. "Fair enough," Oin agreed as he hovered over Bolver. The toy maker had taken a hit to the head, and the healer was attempting to wrap a clean cloth around the wound. "You three are lucky you got out alive at all." "Aye, thanks to my little brother here," Fili crowed, wrapping an arm around Kili's shoulders and shaking him. "Nailed the orc right in the eye, he did. Wouldn't be surprised if he died from the injury." Kili beamed from under his brother's arm. "It was all luck. I wouldn't have gotten a chance if Mr. Baggins hadn't distracted him." "True! Where is our burglar? I need to thank him for saving my life!" Fili cried, standing up and looking around. When his eyes finally found the hobbit, he smiled just as brightly as the sun. "Bulma, why are you so far away? Get over here so I can thank you properly!" the blonde dwarf demanded. Bilbo raised his brows and tried not to smirk too obviously. "So I can smell the orc blood more clearly. I think I'll pass and stay right here. Upwind. Away from the smell." Most of the others broke into laughter at his retort, but Fili scowled in answer. He marched through the dwarves over to the lone hobbit and flopped down in front of him. With the young dwarf so close, Bilbo could now make out his wounds more clearly. What he saw made him wince. "You saved my life back there," Fili said, not noticing his wince or discomfort. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "I could do nothing else," he finished for the dwarf. Fili was beginning to look a bit lost as he recalled the evening, and he didn't want to see him sad again. "I would never let any of you die, not if I can help it." Fili blinked his blue eyes that he shared with his uncle before a wide smile split across his face. Before he knew it, Bilbo found himself being pulled into a hug that squeezed all the air from his lungs at once. "Thank you for saving my life," Fili mumbled into his ear. His beard tickled his ear and neck, but the hobbit was willing to endure it. Honestly, he needed a hug just as much as Fili did at this point. "You're welcome, Fili," he muttered back, trying not to melt into the embrace like a child. "Hey, Fili, stop harassing a burglar and get over here. It's your turn now," Oin ordered from the group as he finished tending to Bolfer. The younger dwarf groaned, but dutifully released Bilbo and got to his feet. Fine, but no poking this time. I got enough of that with the orcs." Bilbo continued to watch over his comrades even after all the wounds were healed, the bellies filled, and they all finally drifted off to sleep. He found that he could not make himself fall asleep quite as easily, and honestly, he didn't want to at this point. He had too much to think about, too much to plan and go over in his head. Not to mention he still felt shaken from nearly losing his dwarves again, thanks to his own stupidity. No, he wasn't going to be sleeping anytime soon. At least he was not the only one still awake. Dori sat next to Nori and Ori and kept looking at them like he couldn't believe they were there. Dwalin was polishing his axe while Gandalf smoked his pipe and seemed to study the night sky above. And then there was Thorin. The royal dwarf was on watch and was sitting by himself a little bit away. Occasionally, he would look back at them and slowly run his blue eyes over each dwarf. When they landed on Fili and Kili, they softened slightly and lingered the longest. Then he would continue on before finally going back to his watch. He didn't blame any of the dwarves for their reassurances. He could hardly help himself either from looking over each of them, taking in every injury and bruise and the careful rise and fall of their chests. He still couldn't shake the lingering fear at nearly losing them again. He stayed awake long enough to watch Dori and Gandalf finally fall asleep, and for Dwalin to switch with Thorin. The king clasped the other dwarf's hand tightly, and the two shared a look that said more than words ever would. Bilbo found himself rather envious. He couldn't do that with his eyes. The envy quickly died away when he realized that instead of going to his bedroll, Thorin was instead making his way to Bilbo's corner. He felt his heartbeat begin to pick up and tried his best to ignore it. Thorin quietly took a seat next to him and made himself comfortable against the boulder. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out his long, dark pipe. The hobbit watched him light it and wondered what type of pipeweed he was smoking. Knowing Thorin, it was something cheap and tasteless. He always had horrible taste in pipeweed and wine. "You were very brave today," the king finally said, taking a long puff and letting the smoke out slowly. "Very quick to think, and very resourceful with the traps. We owe a good portion of our victory to you." Bilbo snorted. He was hardly the reason for their victory. Everyone had done their part to win the battle. Hardly. I wouldn't have made it through the fray if I didn't have all of you there to watch my back. Thorin shrugged. "Say what you like. The rest of us know who won us the battle in the end." "I will," he declared, raising his chin. "And while I'm at it, I would like to add that both Ori and Kili played a big part too. Make sure the others know that." The dwarf nodded slowly. "True. They did well today. We're all very proud of them." "I am too," he admitted to himself. "But I owe my thanks to you in particular," Thorin continued calmly. "You saved not only my nephew today, but my heir and crown prince. Such actions, I cannot even begin to think how to repay them." Bilbo frowned and scratched at one of his wounds on his elbow. "I don't need anything. I could hardly sit by and watch an innocent person die. It wouldn't be right." "So noble," Thorin remarked with the faintest hint of mockery in his tone. He took another long puff of his pipe before blowing the smoke out through his nose. "Regardless of your words, I still owe you a debt. So name your price, burglar." Against his will, Bilbo felt a twinge of hurt pierce his heart at the dwarf's remark. He honestly didn't want anything other than to see his dwarves live through the journey. But Thorin obviously didn't know that, and thought he was angling for something. He understood the reasoning behind it, but it still hurt to be regarded so lowly by someone he held so dear. "I don't need nor want anything from you, Master Oakenshield," he said quietly, turning away to stare back at their sleeping companions. "All I wanted was to see Fili live. That he and the others are alive is enough for me." Thorin was quiet for a long time. He continued smoking his pipe, but made no move to leave the hobbit. Bilbo wondered how long he was going to stay before the king finally spoke again.
I have offended you,
Thorin announced, setting his pipe down.
My apologies. That was not my intent. I wanted to... I'm making a rather large mess of the whole thing, aren't I?
Pretty much, he agreed, rolling his eyes.
You certainly don't hold back with your words,
the dwarf grumbled, but without any real heat.
There has been a misunderstanding here. I did not mean to insult you by implying that you saved Kili simply to gain something.
Bilbo turned back to the king with both brows raised. Really? Then what did you mean to imply? Thorin scratched his beard and seemed to think deeply over how to phrase his words.
What I meant was... Well, with dwarves, we have a certain code to follow. If a dwarf were to give another gift or perform a favor, then it is expected that the recipient would return these actions. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but that's another story.
The dwarf paused and pointed a finger at the hobbit.
You have done my family a favor by saving Kili. Therefore, I am now expected to repay that favor.
So, because I saved Kili, you now have to do something for me, Bilbo summarized slowly. But why you? Shouldn't Kili be the one to repay me?
Kili is not of age yet,
Thorin replied, shrugging.
He is still considered a child by others, so he is not expected to repay the debt. Instead, it falls to me as the head of the family to attend to it.
Oh. Bilbo leaned back and thought about what he had just learned. The first time around, when he had saved the king, Thorin had not mentioned such a debt after. In fact, he couldn't remember ever hearing of it or of Thorin repaying it. Maybe he's telling me now because I saved Kili instead of Thorin this time, he mused to himself. Yes, that sounded more likely. Thorin was likely to view a debt with Kili as more important than his own. He wouldn't do anything less for his nephew. So, how does one go about repaying this debt? Do you have to save my life now? Because I'm pretty sure you've done that already in battle, he pointed out.
Thorin snorted. Hardly. Those are not seen as debts. Defending your brother in combat is expected of every dwarf, and to go against such a thing is to go against our very nature. No, what happens now is that you ask me of something, and I will do everything in my power to give it to you.
But I really don't want anything, he reminded the dwarf, feeling a bit lost over the whole thing.
Really? What about gold or jewels?
Thorin challenged. I'm a hobbit. We value flowers and good food more, he pointed out.
Status, then. A high-ranking official once we became Erebor,
the dwarf countered. To do what? I'm a burglar, not a politician, he rebuked. The king was beginning to grow visibly annoyed.
Women, then, or men, or a new horse, a new house, a new coat, even.
I don't want a lover, I don't need a horse, I own a perfectly lovely home, and if I need a new coat, then I can get it myself. Bilbo listened, growing rather amused by the whole thing now. Please, your majesty, there is nothing I want in this world that you can give to me.
Then, what is it that I can't give you?
The dwarf wondered, furrowing his brows. Your heart. Bilbo bit his bottom lip sharply until it began to bleed. Master Oakenshield, please understand something. As of now, I have no desires other than to see that you all live to reclaim your home. That is the task I have accepted, and I am committed to seeing it through. If that can be accepted as a desire, then I suggest you do everything in your power to stay alive, in order to grant me my wish. Thorin stared at the hobbit with a look that he honestly could not read. It was strange because he swore he knew every look that the king made.
That doesn't exactly meet the qualifications, but I will accept it for now. At least until I can find a suitable payment that you will accept, the dwarf finally remarked, picking up his pipe and slowly rising to his feet.
You will be looking for a long time, he retorted before licking his bottom lip clear of blood. Thorin raised one brow high as the corner of his lips curled back slightly.
Good. I like a challenge.
Then he stalked away silently to where his bedroll was. Bilbo watched him go and wondered not for the first time why he couldn't have fallen for someone less complicated. Bilbo woke later than usual the next morning. By the time he was awake, it was already mid-morning and breakfast had been cooked and served, and the camp was being packed up.
Mr. Baggins,
Bomber greeted when he noticed he was awake.
Come eat, I saved you a plate.
The hobbit yawned and slowly dragged himself to his feet. His body ached slightly from the night before, but he dutifully ignored it over the thought of food. He sat down next to Bomber and rubbed his eyes clear.
My thanks, he rasped before clearing his throat a few times. Thank you, Bomber. I'm glad to have something warm to eat after last night. I guess it has been a long few days, the robust dwarf agreed, handing him the plate of food. But it turned out fine in the end. We all survived and we all found our way back to each other. Bilbo smiled at the cheery cook and began to eat his breakfast. Indeed. Now we can continue on. What's the next stop? We need to get down the mountain first, Bomber replied, stroking his mustache and thought. That should take about 3 days. Maybe more considering the wounded we have. The hobbit nodded and thought over all the maps he knew of in order to get an idea of how far they still had to go. Then from there? We must pass through the Vales of Anduin, and then we need to get through Mirkwood. The dwarf frowned and furrowed his bushy brows. Not looking forward to that part, honestly. Them elves there are sure to pull something. Bilbo didn't doubt it. While he was quite fond of his son Legolas, he honestly never grew to care for Thranduil. The elf was too cold and reserved for his taste. Of course, he also locked up his friends in his dungeon, so perhaps he was being a bit biased. But regardless of his feelings, he knew how important Thranduil would be in the upcoming war. If he wanted to change the outcome of the Battle of Five Armies, then he would need the Elven King's support. Now, Bomber. Don't go scattering our burglar over a couple of leaf eaters, Nori drawled as he joined them. He dropped it down next to Bilbo in a lazy sprawl that still managed to look graceful. I'm not scared of elves. I'm actually quite fond of them, Bilbo retorted with a smirk. The two dwarves shared a look of mutual disgust. Well, it's no accounting for taste, Nori said, eyeing the hobbit beside him. He simply laughed and shook his head. So how are your battle wounds? I assume that Oin has you back in shape. The thief waved a dismissive hand. I'm fine. Those orcs were pathetic. They hardly did any damage. Bilbo carefully looked at the black eye, split lip, and numerous bruises the dwarf was still sporting. Oh, yes, they didn't even leave a mark on you. You two probably would have gotten off easy if you had kept your mouths shut, Bomber pointed out, waving his spoon at his fellow dwarf. No, they wanted to torture us and were looking for an excuse, so me and Bolfer gave them one, Nori explained as he examined his fingernails. I'm sure the young prince had nothing to do with that decision, Bilbo added without bothering to lower his voice. Nori squinted at him. You have something to say there? Me? No, absolutely nothing, Bilbo claimed, widening his eyes until they began to water. I would never imply that you and Bolfer deliberately egged the orcs on so they would be you two instead of Fili. That would be foolish. Bomber burst out laughing while Nori continued to stare at him with his steely green eyes. He met the look evenly and even raised his brows in a silent challenge. Finally, Nori smirked and shook his head. Well played, burglar, well played. We might just make something out of you yet. Hopefully something decent and unlike yourself, you thief, Thorin interjected as he joined the three with a satchel in hand and a scowl on his face. He stood over Nori and crossed his arms and began to loom menacingly. Nori leaned his head back until he could meet his brother's eyes upside down. Hey, Risen, I don't steal things. I liberate valuable property from their unworthy owners. Isn't that another word for thief? Bilbo wondered. Pretty much, Bomber agreed. Nori simply waved a dismissive hand at both of them. Details, details. Now what has my dear older brother in such a fate? Nori reached into the satchel and pulled out a bundle of shimmering red cloth. Did you take this from Rivendell? Why is that the question? You know I did, the younger dwarf retorted, rolling his eyes and turning back to face Bilbo and Bomber. Nori brought the cloth and satchel down in a hard smack against Nori's head. The dwarf didn't flinch. I told you not to take anything from them, Nori scolded archly. What are we even going to do with this? You can't sell it where we're going. Well, I was thinking we could turn it into a coat, Nori drawled, lazily turning his gaze to the hobbit next to him. For our dear burglar, who no longer seems to have one. What? No, save it for something else. I'm fine, Bilbo denied, not wanting to be dragged into the conversation. Make something for Ori with it. I'm sure he'll appreciate it. Ori has enough coats, Nori replied, turning his steely green gaze to the hobbit. But you... I noticed your coat was destroyed last night during the fight. Do you have another one? Of course not! Look at him! Nori answered before Bilbo spoke up. He waved a dramatic hand at the hobbit. He doesn't have any boots or gloves or even an extra shirt left. Our burglar is going to die from the elements before we ever get to Erebor. Bomber nodded in agreement while Nori continued to stare at the hobbit with a rather intense look. Bilbo now felt torn between feeling outraged that Nori thought him so weak, and confused over why clothes were even an issue. I have enough clothes, thank you very much. And hobbits don't wear boots to begin with, so that shouldn't be an issue, he retorted, glaring at the thief. Nori shook his head with a mocking frown on his face. Our dear burglar is too kind for some good. He's willing to risk dying from the cold so as not to inconvenience us with things like sewing and knitting. Such a kind of it. At that point, Nori was looking at him with the sort of look he usually reserved for Ori. Like he was some sort of injured lamb surrounded by a pack of hungry wolves. It was a very alarming look. I'll take your measurements after breakfast. Nori, see that he finishes all his food. I have to find my sewing kit. Nori ordered, rolling up the cloth and stuffing it back into the satchel. Bilbo opened his mouth in protest, but stopped short as Nori shoved a piece of dried meat in. Will do, brother, will do. The thief promised, smirking widely as Nori gave him an approving nod before stalking off to presumably find his sewing kit. That was well played, Bomber complimented from the sidelines. Thank you. It's always nice to be recognized, Nori replied. Bilbo stared at them both, torn between applauding the thief for his sneakiness and wanting to pull his ear for making Nori worry about him. Nori noticed his look, gave him a lazy smirk that was, against all odds, rather charming. Better finish your breakfast there, burglar. Don't want to keep Nori waiting, he advised, and then jumped as Bilbo threw a spoon at his head.